We seem to love binaries, but can life be divided into binaries? The queer answer is no. In fact, if life is a rainbow, its colors bleed into one another. The word queer itself isn't just an addition of sexual and gender identities. It's a perspective. What textbooks and social theory may not be able to teach us, we might learn from the life of Salim Kidwai, a renowned historian and writer, and a very queer man. Salim passed away on August 30th last year. Salim's life presents us with many questions. Is the West more accepting of sexuality than the East? Can we expand our understanding of history to include the future as well as the present? Are politics and pleasure separate, or can they come together? Is age a ladder, higher up on which are the all-knowing elders and lower down the naive young? Is love to be found only in coupledom or in friendships too? Salim Kidwai and Ruth Vanita, a professor at the University of Montana in the United States, wrote a pioneering book titled Same-Sex Love in India, Readings from Literature and History, which drew from Sanskrit and Perso-Urdu traditions, dismantling the myth that homosexuality was a Western idea. Excerpts of this 2001 book became part of the legal case against Section 377, a colonial-era law that effectively criminalized homosexuality. Salim is best known as a queer historian. It was not history alone that he loved. He is also defined by his love for music, beauty, and friends. It is perhaps apt then to remember and reflect on Salim's life not only through his work and activism or through his own words, but also through the words of his friends, the photos they took of him, fond memories, and the music he loved. In 1976, Salim Kidwai was 26 and had been working in Delhi University's Ramjas College for 3 years already, when he left for McGill University in Montreal, Canada, to obtain a PhD in Islamic history. Here, at last, he could meet other gay men and not hide a fundamental part of his being. In 1977, the police raided a gay bar called Trucks and arrested 146 men. Salim was one of them. Recalling his experiences in Trikone magazine later in 2001, Salim wrote, the charges were eventually dropped in 1984. Distressed, Salim returned home without completing his PhD. He also realized that he could make a difference fighting for change back home and not living as an immigrant in a foreign land where institutional homophobia was rampant. Salim first met Sunil Gupta as a graduate scholar in Montreal.
For me, it was always about cruising. Cruising was our central activity. As gay men, we spent an inordinate amount of time hunting down other gay men to have sex with.
Unbelievable how much was going on, how many affairs were going on, how much sex was happening. Lots of it, yeah. I mean, I could take names of a lot of people who are important now.
Salim knew the importance of activism on issues other than the law. In 1999, Salim, Chapal Mehra and a few others created a queer space called Hamrahi.
Hamrahi was a informal group of gay and bisexual men, also questioning men, who came together in the early parts of the queer rights movement. Salim's role was both of a guide and a mentor to many of us, and he not only suggested the directions and the issues that the group should focus on, but also the kind of events and the integration with the other rights movements that we could do.
Salim's significant contribution to the queer struggle in India was located in a very clear understanding of both the contributions and the limits of the law.
Law is only going to be one small single stepping stone. It's a long struggle. And I think this carried on without the social transformation, carried on without the law helping us, might be actually worth the time that we are getting. The time that we have with the law against us. At least we've got sympathy, liberal public's backing for us to sort of engineer a sort of social thing in our favor. And which has been happening, I mean, there's a great deal of tolerance and acceptance that has happened with the law against us. And so this is a situation which is entirely without its benefits,
Salim always said that the law was never the entirety of the queer struggle. Even back in 2013, before the Supreme Court reversed the Delhi High Court judgment, Salim said in an interview to Kamra's Jayashree T.
Sitting in the court and hearing Shyam Devan argue for voices, this is enough for me, because Shyam Devan was speaking in the first person and saying, my life doesn't end in my bedroom.
The historic victory against Section 377 owed much to Salim's work as a historian. At a September 5 remembrance meet organized by friends of Salim over Zoom, Anand Grover, the lawyer who represented Naz in the Delhi High Court, pointed to the critical role that Kidwai and Vanita's book, Same-Sex Love in India, played in the legal fight against Section 377.
Made us realize that really we have a culture which was totally different from what the British had imposed. And it gave us a lot of secure and confidence in being able to mount the challenge. Without that, I think it would have been much, much more difficult. And when I met Salim a couple of times in the meetings that used to be held, he was very unassuming. And I felt I was in awe both of Ruth and Salim.
For Salim, a vision of queer politics solidarity and a rootedness in history was key.
The only way it can happen, I think now that it needs to happen, is alliance building with other minority groups on human rights spaces, You have to become part of other people's struggle.
As we see, Salim's ability to think beyond the law was part of his larger political worldview, which encompassed the entirety of people's existence. This was an important aspect of his politics of solidarity, and we see it also play out in his articulation of what constituted queer politics. For Salim, the significance of history extended beyond academics to the realm of politics at large. History was particularly important for the queer struggle, for it allowed Salim and a generation of queer people that followed to find roots.
This is why the need to write history was so important. I was teaching history without being able to teach my own history. So I was coming across my own history all the time when I was researching on other subjects, but this was something that I couldn't really put out there, because in our time there was complete silence.
For Salim, history was not simply an academic pursuit. It also incorporated the everyday, as reflected in his work with Sanat Kada, a Lucknow-based trust that works with crafts and conducts the well-known Mahindra Sanat Kada festival. Bringing his rigor as a historian to his role as a core team member and mentor, Salim pushed team members to read and research. He was key to visualizing how Lucknow was represented by them. he was highly critical of the often factually incorrect, highly romanticized versions of the history of Lucknow that focused excessively on the Nawabs. Salim's most recent translations were all launched in Sanat Kada, including a translation of a 100-year-old book by Mirza Jafar Hussain called The Classic Cuisine of Lucknow, a food memoir. He was key to planning the Sanat Kada Adda, a space for talks and discussions. Salim's friends pointed to his deep distress at the rise of right-wing, state-backed fundamentalist forces post-2014, particularly in the state of Uttar Pradesh, where he was born, had grown up, and in his later years returned to. Salim embodied the tehzeeb that Lucknow, with its rich Mughal and Awadhi past, was renowned for.
अगर इंसान तारीख़ से सीखता नहीं है, अगर तारीख़ से कोई सबक नहीं सीखेगा तो ज़रूर दोहराएगी, क्योंकि तारीख़ एक किस्म की सोसाइटी की मेमोरी कह सकते हैं आप, और अगर जैसे इंसान की मेमोरी ना हो तो क्या होगा, उस इंसान का कभी कोई काम सही नहीं कर सकता है। इसलिए अगर जो तारीख़ जो पढ़ते हैं और फिर भी नहीं सीखते हैं तो ज़रूर तारीख़ दोहराती है अपने को, और ख़ासकर जो गलतियां होती हैं।
Salim's concerns as well as sources of strength moved seamlessly between the political and personal.
I really resent ending up single is actually some sort of reflection on you. I think being single has been a conscious or subconscious or a conscious choice, my choice all along. I could have chosen not to be single and unhappy in an unhappy situation or in a series of unhappy relationships. I've chosen to be single.
A crucial element of Salim's queer politics lay in his critique of heteronormative ideas of lifelong coupledom exemplified in the patriarchal institution of marriage. Salim invested a great deal in friendship.
And that is the whole idea of friendship as a kind of an organizing principle of living, to say that, it could be at the center of different kinds of loving and living arrangements, and that, where, marriage could be only one of that. And I think we did that because, we were both we considered ourselves to be bachelors, and we defined the idea of eligible bachelors in a rather queer way.
Sohini also spoke of how the book Same-Sex Love itself dismantled the binary between love and friendship and brought out the porous borders of these ideas. Salim's friendship with ghazal singer Begum Akhtar was well known and went deep. Years after her death in 1974, Salim, members of Sanat Kada, and some others took responsibility for maintaining Begum Akhtar's mazar in Lucknow. They also organized the annual Hazri on her death anniversary, to which renowned musicians were invited. Pleasure expressed itself in many ways in Salim's life. The parties in Delhi that he organized with friend Manjari Dingwane were radical and queer. The sheer enjoyment of singing and dancing created intimate spaces between people beyond the binary of gay and straight. Pleasure in Salim's life also broke the binary between highbrow and popular culture. His passion for Hindustani classical music and Begum Akhtar were matched only by his passion for old Bollywood songs, which he had tremendous knowledge of and archived rigorously. Salim loved gossip. With his twinkling eyes and inimitable chuckle, he took a childlike delight in it. Gossip also served as an important tool for researchers and archivists. Salim often told those who approached him for advice and resources. It broke the binary between pleasure and work. Pleasure expressed itself in the everyday, in the sensuality of the fine cotton chikankari kurtas Salim wore, and in the warm offering of the renowned Awadhi-style hospitality at his home in Lucknow, where books lined the walls so beautifully. Salim lived his life in a way that always included those who were much younger than him. Even though Salim would never think of himself as old, for many activists who were younger than him, his wisdom and experience were valuable. What they learnt from him was both personal and political.
I feel very privileged to have been 20 years old and coming back to Delhi, coming into a world that had a generation of older queer people. And it was the unasked question for all of us, right? How do we age? How do we grow old without any of the maps and any of the structures, without marriage, without coupledom, how do we grow old? And I remember meeting Salim Kirwai and being completely awestruck. And I remember thinking, he's here.
Moving from the personal to the political, Gautam narrated an incident when he had decided to stop speaking to another queer activist with whom he had had a political difference.
And he looked at me, and it's the only time I have seen Salim angry, and he snapped and he said, "We do not do that." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We don't let go of people."
I wanted to draw from a personal moment of anxiety and Salim's calming presence in that moment. And this was when my biological family thought of me as a bad influence on my nephew because of my openly queer lifestyle. And of course, it's something that generated shame and self-doubt in me as an uncle. And I began to cut myself off from my family. And at the time, Salim reassured me that my nephew would grow up to be proud of me. And this was especially reassuring because I knew Salim was an uncle himself to someone who was known to me at the time, Jamal. Anyhow, unrelated to that moment, and perhaps later sometime, Salim also alerted me to the hypocrisies of biological families that, abjure their responsibility towards aging parents, and especially when these parents need to be taken care of the most. And us queer folks are taken for granted in providing this kind of care. Apparently, because that's the least that we can do after having failed on other fronts, such as getting married and reproducing our biological children. And sadly, something on these lines might be unfolding in my life currently. And I feel like Salim is smirking and saying, "I told you so." So be it, Salim. You will be missed.
Ponni Arasu spoke of how she too considered Salim to be an elder.
Identities are significant and we don't have the privileges to let go of them, but we also have to remember that we cannot be choked by them. How this connects to Salim and my experience of Salim is that I did not invent this wheel as a queer activist. I inherited this legacy from people like Salim, from how he chose, what work he chose to do, from what friends he kept, from who he edited Same-Sex Love in India with, right? So we were not the first ones to construct these solidarities. I was very aware from the very beginning of my political life as a queer person that this is a history that I already had. All I had to do is go and find my place within that as the next generation of queer activists in the early 2000s onwards. So I want to talk about a little about the concept of elders. And this is a gift I got from some of the indigenous folks on Turtle Island, also known as Canada, because they use the term elders in a manner where elders teach the young and the young teach the elders. Time is circular and not linear. So for a South Asian person, these words are creepy, right? Because immediately you think of elder relatives and listening to them and obeying them and so on and so forth. But I got this beautiful gift from these peoples across many oceans from my own land of elders. So it's a concept that is one where we learn from one another. It isn't ageist or hierarchical in any sense. And this too I learned from the likes of Saleem, because we sat and chatted about all the things that we all cared about. And I felt respected. I felt like my opinions were worth it. And I'm sure I asked lots of questions that may have felt very basic to him, or maybe he had to answer them over and over again, I'm sure, as I'm often doing nowadays, because I'm no longer the youngest person in the room. And I never felt that this burdened him. And on the contrary, I felt like it always energized him.
A single life that was far from sad. Not just gayness, but queerness in which all manner of binaries and hierarchies were challenged. A return from the so-called free world that turned out to be violent to India and the unearthing of its highly erotic past. Popular songs of Guide and Pakiza cherished no less than the art of Begum Akhtar's Ghazal Gaiki. Parties that were sheer pleasure and fun, not just gay. Friendships as romantic and as passionate as love. Gossip that was not just a lot of fun, but also a strong tool of research. The elder with a twinkle in his eyes. Breaking the frames of time, delving into the past, in the hope that the same mistakes will not be made in the future.
तुम जाओ जाओ मुझसे न बोलो सौतन के संग रहो। तो मैंने उनको ये भेजा इस तरह